It was a busy Thursday afternoon when the flight from New York to Los Angeles was getting ready for takeoff. Among the passengers, one stood out. He was seated in first class, a tall man in a sleek suit, his expensive watch gleaming under the cabin lights. His arrogance seemed to radiate from him, and he barely acknowledged the flight attendants as they moved about, preparing for the flight. Ava, young flight attendant, was no stranger to difficult passengers. She had been working with the airline for nearly 3 years, and had seen it all: complaints, rudeness, and the occasional over-the-top behavior. But something about this man was different. He looked at her with disdain, his eyes dismissive as she offered him a drink. "Water, please," he said, barely glancing at her, his tone flat, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. As Ava passed the glass of water to him, she noticed the look he gave her, judging her, evaluating her, as if she were beneath him. His mocking smile didn't go unnoticed. It stung, but she kept her composure. This was her job, and she had to rise above it. But then, as she made her way down the aisle to check on the other passengers, she overheard him laughing with a fellow traveler. His words were loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Can you believe they hire people like that?" he sneered. "Barely trained, probably from some small town. I bet she doesn't even know how to handle the real demands of this job." Ava's heart sank. It wasn't the first time she had heard such cruel words, but this felt different. This man had no respect, no appreciation for the hard work that went into keeping everything running smoothly at 30,000 feet. She tried to shake off the sting, focusing on her duties. Still, his voice echoed in her mind as the plane lifted off the ground, leaving New York behind. The journey was about to take an unexpected turn. As the plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, the passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight. Ava moved down the aisles, offering snacks and drinks to the passengers in business class. Her uniform felt heavier now, not from the weight of the fabric, but from the burden of the words she had overheard. Despite her efforts to stay focused, her mind kept drifting back to the VIP passenger. His behavior was starting to eat at her, and she couldn't help but feel the sting of his mockery. The longer she worked, the more his condescending remarks seemed to linger in the back of her mind. Then, as she reached his row again, he called out to her. "Hey, you!" His voice was sharp, commanding. Ava took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever would come next. She turned, forcing a polite smile onto her face. "Yes, sir? How may I assist you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the frustration rising in her chest. He glanced at her for a moment before nodding toward his seat. "My seat's uncomfortable. Can you do something about it? Maybe get me an upgrade? I'm not paying all this money for this kind of service." His tone was filled with entitlement. Ava's fingers tightened around the tray she was holding. She didn't let the irritation show, though it was hard to mask. "I'm sorry, sir. We're currently at full capacity, and there aren't any upgrades available at the moment," she explained. The passenger scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Pathetic. Figures." He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Honestly, I'd expect better service from someone who actually knows what they're doing." Her heart pounded as she fought to remain professional, the humiliation crawling under her skin. She nodded and moved away, determined not to let him see how much his words had affected her. But Ava had no idea that karma was already quietly making its way toward them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment would come sooner than anyone expected. As the flight continued, Ava moved through the aisles, offering her services to the other passengers. She tried her best to block out the negativity of the VIP passenger, focusing on her work. But the man's words had cut deeper than she cared to admit, and they hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Hours passed, and the cabin lights dimmed as the flight entered a more serene phase. Most of the passengers had settled in for a nap, while others watched movies or read books. Ava was tired, but she kept moving, checking on the rows and making sure everyone had what they needed. But then, the plane began to experience some turbulence. It wasn't anything unusual, just the kind of gentle bumps that were common when crossing through different air pockets. Still, it was enough to get the attention of the passengers. Ava felt the plane shake slightly, but she kept her calm. She had dealt with turbulence many times before. However, something felt off. The bumps were getting more frequent, more intense. Ava's training kicked in, and she quickly moved toward the front of the cabin to check with the captain. As she made her way forward, she could hear murmurs from the passengers. Some of them were uneasy, others were quietly praying. She reached the cockpit, where the captain was already on the radio, speaking urgently with air traffic control. His face was serious, his hands gripping the controls. Ava's stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. "We're gonna have to divert," the captain said, his voice low but steady. "There's a storm brewing up ahead. I'll need you to prepare the cabin for potential turbulence." Ava nodded, her heart racing. She returned to the cabin, her mind already racing through the procedures she would need to follow. The turbulence had intensified, and the plane was now shaking with more force. As she moved down the aisles, she noticed the VIP passenger again. He was gripping the armrests of his seat, his face pale, eyes wide. For the first time since the flight had begun, there was no trace of arrogance in his expression. He looked afraid. The plane jolted again, this time with a more violent shake. A few of the passengers gasped, and some even screamed as the plane dipped slightly, making everyone feel the weight of the danger. The VIP passenger's hand shot up, trembling. "Help me! Help me!" he shouted, his voice panicked. Ava looked at him, her heart torn between the professional duty she'd trained for and the memories of his earlier insults. The moment hung in the air. But she didn't hesitate. She rushed over to him, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, you need to buckle your seatbelt and stay calm. We're going to get through this." The man looked up at her, his eyes desperate. I can't. "Trust me," she said, kneeling beside him. "We're trained for this. You're going to be okay." In that moment, something shifted. The man's arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by raw fear. He grabbed her hand, his grip tight, as though her presence was the only thing anchoring him to reality. Ava stayed with him, offering reassurance as the turbulence continued to rock the plane. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something much bigger than any of them could have anticipated. The turbulence seemed to drag on forever, each violent shake of the plane making the atmosphere more tense. Ava's mind was focused entirely on her duties, guiding passengers through the fear, making sure everyone remained buckled and calm. But even as she moved through the cabin, offering words of comfort and helping secure items, she couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over her. It was as if the plane itself was resisting the skies, fighting against an unseen force. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but strained. "We've hit unexpected turbulence, folks. We're working to stabilize the situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll keep you updated." The words didn't provide much comfort. If anything, they made the tension worse. Ava kept moving down the aisles, checking on passengers, making sure everything was in order. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the VIP passenger. She couldn't help but wonder if his earlier mockery had somehow come back to haunt him. And then, it happened. A sudden, sharp jolt made the entire plane lurch. Ava grabbed the nearest seat back to steady herself, her heart pounding. She heard a few gasps from the passengers, followed by a loud crash as an overhead bin popped open, scattering luggage into the aisles. Ava's instincts kicked in immediately, but she couldn't ignore the most shocking thing: the VIP passenger. He had lost control. He was no longer sitting, no longer gripping the armrests. Instead, he was on the floor, kneeling and clutching his stomach, his face twisted in panic. The veneer of superiority he had worn all throughout the flight had shattered completely, replaced by a person who was utterly vulnerable. Ava quickly moved toward him, her professional training kicking in despite everything. "Sir, you need to stay calm," she said firmly, but this time her tone wasn't as gentle. It was clear that the man wasn't just terrified, he was struggling. "Please, help me," he gasped, tears welling in his eyes. The man who had mocked her was now pleading with her, his voice full of desperation. Her mind raced. The situation was getting more chaotic by the second, but she couldn't turn away. She knelt beside him, her face calm despite the storm of emotions inside her. "Sir, I need you to breathe. Focus on your breath. Everything will be okay," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. His skin was clammy under her touch. For a moment, their roles reversed. He was no longer the powerful, arrogant man in first class, but a fragile human being, afraid of what might happen next. Ava could feel her anger at his earlier comments begin to dissolve. It didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was getting everyone through this. Suddenly, the lights flickered and a loud bang echoed through the cabin. The plane jolted again, this time with a violent force that sent more gasps of fear through the passengers. Ava's heart skipped a beat as she noticed the panic spreading. The turbulence wasn't the only thing they had to fear now. The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, the tension almost suffocating. The plane lurched once more, throwing passengers into a temporary disarray. Ava held on to the nearest seat, her heart racing as she tried to steady herself. The VIP passenger, still kneeling on the floor, looked completely disoriented now. His earlier arrogance had vanished, leaving only a fragile shell of a man. "What's happening?" someone shouted from the back of the plane, the panic in their voice contagious. Ava forced herself to stay calm, trying to reassure everyone, though she could feel the fear creeping up in her own chest. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, this time more urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. We are experiencing an emergency situation, and we need your cooperation. Please follow all instructions from the crew." The words cut through the air, and the sense of dread deepened. Ava's stomach dropped. It wasn't just turbulence anymore. Something had happened. Something that had pushed the plane to the edge. As she moved toward the cockpit again, she caught a glimpse of the VIP passenger's face. He was staring out the window now, his eyes wide with horror, as if he were realizing for the first time that he might not be in control. It wasn't long before the air masks dropped from the ceiling with a hissing sound. The sight of them, each mask dangling ready to be pulled down, added another layer of urgency to the situation. "Put your mask on," Ava shouted to the passengers around her, quickly securing her own. Her hands were shaking, but she fought to maintain the professionalism she had trained for. The turbulence had intensified again, and now the feeling of weightlessness was becoming more frequent, sending the plane diving and rising like a roller coaster. Ava moved back toward the VIP passenger, her heart pounding as she noticed the fear plastered across his face. He was holding his seatbelt in both hands, looking lost, completely overwhelmed. "Sir, you need to put your mask on," she instructed, leaning down to meet his eyes. He didn't respond immediately, his mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came out. His eyes were filled with something she hadn't seen before, pure terror. He was no longer mocking her or the situation. In this moment, he was as vulnerable as any of the other passengers. Ava's mind was racing as she looked around, her gaze sweeping over the panicked faces. The cabin was a whirlwind of fear. But, amidst the chaos, she kept herself together. She needed to help. There was no room for hesitation. "Sir, please," she urged, this time kneeling in front of him, taking his hands gently in hers. "You need to trust me. We're gonna get through this." It was in that moment when their eyes met and she saw the desperation in his, that she realized something. He wasn't just afraid for his life, he was afraid of what he had become, a person who had dismissed others without thought, a person who had been cruel to those who served him. Now, he was facing the very real possibility of losing everything. And Ava, she was the one he turned to. The very person he had mocked. "Please help me," he whispered, his voice breaking. Ava nodded. She didn't have time to think about the past. The only thing that mattered was the present and the lives in her hands. She gently placed the oxygen mask over his face, securing it as best as she could, while keeping her own mask firmly in place. The moment felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. But Ava knew she had a job to do. And despite the fear, despite the chaos, she would do it. Outside the windows, the storm raged. But in the cabin, the storm inside was just beginning to shift. The plane continued to shake violently, and Ava's breath was shallow as she stood near the VIP passenger, watching the rest of the cabin with an acute awareness. She was hyper-focused on the passengers, ensuring everyone was as safe as possible, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man who had mocked her just hours earlier. His words had felt like daggers at the time, but now, with his life hanging in the balance, it seemed irrelevant. The chaos was palpable. The oxygen masks hung from the ceiling like an eerie reminder of the danger they were facing. Passengers gripped their seats in fear, eyes wide, some crying, others whispering prayers. Every few moments, the plane lurched, the pressure in the cabin shifting with each bump in the air. Ava's heart was racing in time with the turbulence, but her eyes stayed steady, her hands moving with practiced precision. The VIP passenger's grip tightened on his seat, his body shaking. Ava noticed that his hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the terror that had taken hold of him. His earlier smugness, his comments, his dismissal of her and the others, were all gone now. The man who had been so full of himself was a mere shadow of his former self. "How much longer?" he whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking. Ava didn't have an answer for him. None of them did. All they could do was wait, hope, and hold on. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it was softer, almost apologetic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently attempting to reroute the plane to the nearest airport. Please remain calm. We are doing everything we can to stabilize the situation." Ava nodded to herself, hearing the captain's words, but knowing that the uncertainty of the moment left a deep pit in her stomach. She moved through the aisles again, checking on the other passengers. It was during this brief check that she noticed something strange. A sudden, deep silence had fallen over the cabin. The usual hum of the engines seemed muffled, like the sound had been sucked out of the air. She glanced toward the cockpit. Her instincts told her something was wrong. The captain had mentioned rerouting, but this silence was unnerving. Ava quickly returned to the front of the plane, moving with purpose. Her heart beat faster with every step. When she reached the cockpit door, she knocked gently, though she knew the urgency of the situation would override any formalities. The captain's voice was calm but tight when he responded. "Ava, I need you to stay in the cabin. We're facing some issues up here. I'll let you know as soon as I can." Ava hesitated. Something in his voice didn't sit right. He was trying to maintain control, but the weight of his words told her there was more going on than he was letting on. She nodded silently, her mind racing as she turned back toward the cabin. When she reached the middle section of the plane, her pulse quickened. The VIP passenger was looking at her, his eyes filled with both fear and something else, a strange, quiet recognition. "I'm sorry," he said softly, the apology sounding genuine but coming too late. I didn't know it would be like this." Ava didn't know how to respond. There was no time for words of forgiveness or explanations. All she could do was offer him a brief nod, acknowledging his sincerity. But there was no time to dwell on the past. The plane jolted again, but this time it was different. It felt controlled. The shaking wasn't as frantic, and the descent felt more purposeful. Something had changed. Ava quickly moved back to her post, scanning the cabin, her heart still pounding. Her hands were steady, but her mind kept replaying the same questions. What was happening? Were they really gonna make it? Outside, the storm raged. But as the plane shifted slightly, Ava caught a glimpse of light ahead. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir a flicker of hope in her chest. The VIP passenger, now with a calmer expression, had taken a deep breath and buckled his seatbelt. The shift in his demeanor wasn't lost on her. He had gone from arrogant and dismissive to vulnerable and grateful. Perhaps this was the true meaning of karma, unfolding before their eyes, as the plane made its descent. Ava stayed by his side, watching the horizon in the distance, as the plane began to lower toward the airport below. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you thought. If you want to see more dramatic twists, real-life karma moments, and unexpected turns, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And if you know someone who'd love this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.